There is a number that could shut off the lights for 25 million Americans overnight: 895 feet. That is the level where Lake Mead hits what engineers call dead pool. The point where Hoover Dam stops making power completely. No turbines spinning, no water moving, nothing. And right now, the $6 billion gamble built to stop that from happening is failing. Here is what makes this terrifying. The lake came back up after a couple of good snow seasons. The headlines said the crisis was over. Politicians called it a comeback. But underneath that rise, the math has not changed. More water is leaving this system every single year than the river actually puts in. It has been for over 100 years. The white ring on the canyon walls, that chalky scar you can see from space, is still climbing. And hidden underneath all of this is a secret that 7 states and the federal government have been too afraid to say out loud since 1922. So the real question is not whether Deadpool is coming. The question is, who is going to tell 25 million people that the water is almost gone? There is a drive you can take out of Las Vegas on Highway 93 that will tell you everything you need to know about what is happening to the American West. You head southeast through the desert, past the casinos and the billboards and the sprawl, and then the land drops away, and you are looking down into Black Canyon. And the first thing you notice is not the dam, it is the line. It runs along both walls of the canyon from one end to the other, a white chalk scar cutting across miles of dark red rock. Mineral stains left behind as the water pulled away, year by year, foot by foot, for more than 2 decades. That white ring rises taller than a 10-story building. You can see it from space. You can see it from the Las Vegas Strip on a clear day. It is the biggest watermark of a water crisis anywhere on Earth, and it has been growing since before most people started paying attention. That line is Lake Mead, telling you exactly how much it has lost. At full pool, Lake Mead holds roughly 26 million acre-feet of water. 1 acre-foot is about 326,000 gallons, enough to keep 2 average American homes running for an entire year. When the lake is full, the water sits at 1,221 feet above sea level. Today, even after 2 decent snow seasons in the Rockies, the lake sits somewhere around 1,070 to 1,080 feet. That is still roughly 140 feet below where it is supposed to be. Still barely more than a quarter full. A lake that was built to hold 9 full years of Colorado River flow now holds closer to 2. In July of 2022, it dropped to around 1,040 feet, the lowest it had been since the lake was first filled back in the 1930s. Closer to dead pool than at any point in its 90-year life. Dead pool is 895 feet. That is the elevation where water can no longer flow through Hoover Dam on its own. No pressure, no movement, no power, and no water supply for 25 million people spread across 7 states. After the 2022 low, good snowpack in the Rockies pushed levels back up. Headlines called it a recovery. People exhaled. Social media showed images of water creeping back up that white ring. But a 30-foot rise in a lake that is still 140 feet below full is not a recovery. It is a pause. The white ring is still there, still enormous, still growing. And the math underneath that temporary rise has not changed at all. In November of 1922, leaders from 7 states gathered at a lodge in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to divide up one of the most valuable resources in the American West. The man running the table was Herbert Hoover, then the Secretary of Commerce, years before he became president, years before the dam that would carry his name was even a blueprint. The idea seemed simple enough. Look at how much water the Colorado River carries every year, and split it fairly among the states that need it. Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. 7 states, 1 river, 1 deal. They looked at the flow records they had from the past few decades and divided up 16.5 million acre-feet per year. 7.5 million to the upper basin states, 7.5 million to the lower basin states. Another 1.5 million promised to Mexico by treaty a little later. Everyone shook hands. Everyone went home satisfied, and they built an entire civilization on top of that agreement. There was just one problem, a massive one, a 100-year one. The flow data they used came from an unusually wet stretch of history. The late 1800s and early 1900s saw some of the heaviest Colorado River flows in centuries. A rare cluster of high water years that made the river look far bigger and far more reliable than it actually was. They were not measuring the real river. They were measuring a fluke. And they wrote that fluke into law. Climate researchers at UCLA went back and studied more than 1,000 years of tree ring data to find the river's true long-term average. What they found should have shaken every water manager in the Southwest to their core. The Colorado River's real average flow is closer to 12 to 13 million acre-feet per year. In dry years, it carries less than 10. The compact had promised 25 to 30% more water than the river has ever truly been able to deliver. Some scientists at the time actually knew the numbers looked too generous. They raised concerns that the river was being measured during an oddly favorable stretch. But the political momentum was impossible to slow down. 7 states had finally agreed on something, and nobody wanted to reopen the deal with smaller numbers. So they signed it, they cheered it, and they built cities, farms, power grids, and entire ways of life directly on top of a promise the river could never keep. For decades, Lake Mead and Lake Powell masked the lie. The stored water covered the gap every year. But that cushion is almost gone now. And when a savings account finally hits zero, every shortfall shows up immediately. Stack a broken promise on top of the worst drought in recorded history, and you start to understand why engineers are now using words like emergency alongside one of America's most iconic landmarks. That same UCLA research team that uncovered the river's true long-term average also studied the drought gripping the Colorado River basin right now. What they found was staggering. This is not just a bad dry spell. This is the worst drought in at least 1,200 years. Not the driest single year on record. The driest sustained stretch going back further than the founding of Oxford University. Further back than the signing of the Magna Carta. You have to go all the way to the 800 AD to find a dry period this long and this severe in the American Southwest. So here is where the crisis becomes almost impossible to solve with infrastructure alone. The states are legally entitled to 16.5 million acre-feet per year. The river delivers 12 to 13 million in a normal year. That is a gap of 3 to 4 million acre-feet every single year, even without a drought. Now layer on top of that the worst megadrought in 12 centuries, and the gap becomes a canyon. Even in a good snow year, more water leaves this system than enters it. The math does not work. It has never worked. And it is getting worse. The federal government and the states have spent somewhere around $6 billion trying to hold the system together. Emergency low-water turbines were rushed into Hoover Dam to keep it generating any power at all as the lake dropped. Infrastructure across the basin has been upgraded, patched, and rebuilt under pressure. And one project stands above all the rest as the single most critical piece of emergency engineering in the Southwest. It is called the third straw. Pat Mulroy ran the Southern Nevada Water Authority for over 2 decades, starting in 1989. She read the climate studies. She watched the lake levels drop year after year. And she warned anyone who would listen that Las Vegas was heading toward a cliff. Her critics called her an alarmist. They said she was exaggerating to chase funding. She built the tunnel anyway. 3 miles long, bored through solid rock beneath the bed of Lake Mead at an elevation of roughly 860 feet, well below the original intake pipes. The project cost $1.4 billion and wrapped up in 2015. By 2022, it was the only reason water still came out of the tap in a city of 2.2 million people. But the third straw does not fix the river. It just lets Las Vegas drink from the bottom of a shrinking glass. To understand what dead pool actually means for 25 million people, you have to understand what Hoover Dam really is. Most people think of it as a wall holding back water. It is that. But it is also one of the most important power plants in the entire western United States. And power plants need pressure. When Hoover Dam was finished in 1935, 2 years ahead of schedule, it was the largest concrete structure on Earth. 726 feet tall from base to top, 45 feet thick at the crown, and 660 feet thick at the base. Enough concrete to pave a 2-lane road from San Francisco to New York City. 5,000 workers built it around the clock in shifts through summers where temperatures inside Black Canyon hit 120 degrees. 96 of them died during construction. The dam went up in the depths of the Great Depression, and men lined up by the thousands for a shot at a job that could kill them. It was, and in many ways still is, the most audacious thing America ever built. The dam generates electricity through something called hydraulic head. The principle is straightforward. Water falls from the surface of the lake through massive intake towers, drops hundreds of feet through giant pipes, and slams into turbines at the base of the dam. The higher the lake sits, the harder that water hits, and the more electricity those turbines push out into the grid. At full pool, Hoover Dam produces roughly 2,080 megawatts of electricity, enough to keep the lights on in about 1.3 million homes across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. For decades, that power was cheap, reliable, and taken completely for granted. Then the lake started dropping. Every single foot of lost elevation cuts the force driving those turbines. At the 2022 historic low, Hoover Dam's output had already fallen by somewhere between 25 and 40%. The Bureau of Reclamation scrambled to install emergency low-water turbines, smaller units designed to squeeze power out of reduced pressure, just to keep the dam producing anything at all. One of America's most critical power plants was running on backup equipment. And then there is the water intake problem that almost nobody talks about. The original pipes feeding Las Vegas were engineered for a lake that stays above 1,000 feet. As water dropped toward that threshold, those intakes risked pulling in air instead of water. For a city of 2.2 million people that gets roughly 90% of its drinking water from Lake Mead, that is not an engineering inconvenience. At 895 feet, the turbines stop completely, the water stops moving, and the lights start going out across the American Southwest. The crisis at Lake Mead is not an abstract problem on a chart. It has already arrived for thousands of families who had less money and less political pull than the cities that built their skylines on Colorado River water. In Pinal County, Arizona, about an hour south of Phoenix, farming families watched their water disappear almost overnight. The Central Arizona Project Canal carries Colorado River water across 336 miles of open desert to reach farms and cities across the state. It is a concrete river running through cactus and sand, one of the most expensive water systems ever constructed. When the federal government declared a shortage in 2022, Pinal County's farmers were among the very first to lose their allocation. They held the lowest priority water rights in the state, which meant they were first in line to take the cut. Fields that had grown cotton, alfalfa, and grain for generations went dry almost immediately. Hundreds of acres of cracked brown earth where green used to grow. A farmer named Will the Lander told reporters he had dried out over 1,000 acres of working farmland. Some of these families had worked the same land across multiple generations. Now, their water rights were paper promises that a shrinking river could no longer honor. The A.K. Chin Indian community, a tribal nation in Pinal County that had farmed with water for centuries, saw their supply cut as well. For a community that spent decades fighting through courts and Congress just to secure their water rights, watching those rights evaporate in a shortage they did not create carries a weight that goes far beyond lost crops. And then the lake itself started revealing what the water had been hiding. As Lake Mead receded, it uncovered barrels containing human remains dating back to the 1970s and the 1980s. A World War II-era landing craft rose from the mud near the Overton Arm, sitting undisturbed on the bottom for nearly 80 years. Each discovery made headlines, but each headline was really saying the same thing. The water is lower than it has ever been, and it keeps showing what it used to hide. Everything building under this crisis is about to collide with a hard deadline. The rules that currently govern how Colorado River water gets divided during shortages expire in 2026. When they run out, 7 state governments and the federal government must sit down and negotiate a new agreement. And that negotiation is shaping up to be the most brutal water fight in American history. The Upper Basin states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, are drawing a firm line. They argue, with some justification, that they have never fully used the water rights they were granted back in 1922. They have allocations on paper that they have never completely tapped, and they have no interest in being penalized because the lower basin states spent decades consuming far more than their fair share. The lower basin states see it entirely differently. California, Arizona, and Nevada hold the largest cities, the most powerful agricultural operations, and the heaviest political weight. California alone consumes more Colorado River water than any other single state. Arizona has already absorbed significant cuts in recent years, painful ones that hit farmers and communities hard. Nevada has invested billions in water conservation, recycling nearly every drop of indoor wastewater back into the system, and still faces pressure to give up more. Every state at the table has a point, and the river does not care about any of them. Then there is Mexico, a party most Americans forget entirely. A 1944 treaty guarantees Mexico 1.5 million acre-feet of Colorado River water per year. That is a legal agreement between 2 sovereign nations. It cannot simply be discarded because the math got uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Lake Powell, the second largest reservoir in the country, sitting 300 miles upstream on the Utah-Arizona border, has been following the exact same downward path as Lake Mead. In 2022, the Bureau of Reclamation made emergency water releases from Flaming Gorge in Wyoming, over 400 miles upstream, just to keep Glen Canyon Dam above its minimum operating level. 2 of the biggest man-made lakes in America were both in crisis simultaneously, and the federal government was moving water from one sinking ship to another. Picture what dead pool actually looks like in practice, not as a number on an engineer's chart, as a lived reality for 25 million people across the American Southwest. Hoover Dam goes silent. The turbines stop spinning. The power output that Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California have depended on for nearly a century drops to zero. There is no equivalent replacement waiting in the wings, no backup plant that fills that gap overnight. The cities and industries and data centers and hospitals built on the assumption of continuous power from Black Canyon suddenly face a grid disruption at a scale the region has never experienced. Las Vegas loses the backbone of its water supply. Even the third straw, that $1.4 billion emergency tunnel bored through solid rock, has a floor. A lake sitting at 895 feet pushes even the deepest intake toward its limits. A city of 2.2 million people that gets 90% of its drinking water from Lake Mead does not have a backup plan that works at that scale. Further downstream, the Imperial Valley loses its water allocation. The 700,000 acres of desert farmland that grows 2/3 of America's winter vegetables stops producing. The lettuce, the broccoli, The carrots that stock grocery shelves from California to Maine disappear from supply chains. A water emergency in the desert Southwest becomes a food price crisis in every American city. The dam itself will stand. It is 5 million cubic yards of concrete locked into the volcanic rock of Black Canyon. Engineers built it to outlast the country that made it. But a dam without sufficient water behind it is not infrastructure. It is a monument. The $6 billion spent on emergency turbines, intake tunnels, and system-wide upgrades bought something valuable. It bought time, but it did not buy a solution. Every good winter slows the drop. None has closed the gap. The river still delivers less than the states are legally owed. The mega drought is still running, and the white ring on the canyon walls is still climbing, 1 foot at a time, closer to 895. Pat Mulroy said it plainly years ago, long before most people were willing to admit what the numbers were already showing. The question was never whether the Colorado River would run short. It was always when, and whether anyone would act before it was too late. She built the third straw because she already knew the answer. She watched the lake levels for decades, read the climate studies that nobody wanted to sit with, and concluded that waiting for political consensus was the same as doing nothing. So she stopped waiting. She spent $1.4 billion drilling through solid rock at the bottom of a shrinking lake and called it the minimum responsible thing to do. Her critics called her an alarmist. By 2022, her tunnel was the only reason Las Vegas still had running water. The river is still flowing. The dam is still standing. But Lake Mead sits 140 feet below where it was built to operate. The power output is weaker. The intakes have been rebuilt twice. The farms downstream are running on less water every year. The river no longer reaches the sea. A river powerful enough to carve the Grand Canyon over 6 million years now dries up in the Sonoran Desert, miles short of the ocean it once fed, centuries before the compact existed. 25 million people are not waiting for rain. They are waiting for 7 state governments and a federal agency to agree on who gets less. And in over 100 years of trying, not one of them has volunteered to go first. Every negotiation ends with the same result. Everyone agrees the math is broken. Nobody agrees to fix it. The $6 billion gamble bought time. But the gap between what the river carries and what the states are owed has not closed. The mega drought is still running. The snowpack helps for a season, and then the dry years return. And the white ring on the canyon walls keeps climbing, 1 foot at a time, marking every year of delay, like a scar cut into the rock. 895 feet is not a prediction anymore. It is a direction.